Colorado Territory, 1875. The shadow of Pike's Peak stretched across the valley like God's own sundial, marking the hour when Owen Quincy first rode into Columbine Springs. The late afternoon sun gilded the town's weathered buildings, making even the most ramshackle structures seem touched with promise. His buckskin mare, trail-weary but steady, picked her way down the main street as Owen's eyes cataloged everything: the general store, the blacksmith, the saloon with its tinny piano music spilling into the street, and the small hotel that would have to do for the night. At 25, Owen had already lived more lifetimes than most men twice his age. The war had taken his innocence, the frontier his family, and the long trail drives whatever softness might have remained in him. His lean face, though handsome with its straight nose and square jaw, rarely smiled. A week's worth of light stubble covered his cheeks, and dust from the trail had worked its way into every crease of his clothing. Only his eyes, a startling clear blue against his sun-darkened skin, hinted at depths beyond the hard exterior. "No sense in getting attached to this place," he muttered to his horse as he dismounted before the livery stable. "We will be moving on by week's end." It was the same thing he told himself in every town, on every ranch, at every new beginning. The frontier was no place for putting down roots. A man survived by staying free, unburdened, ready to move when trouble came or opportunity called. Connections were dangerous. They made you vulnerable in a land that punished vulnerability with swift and merciless efficiency. What Owen told himself he wanted was simple: work until he had enough money to buy his own spread somewhere far from anywhere, where a man could live by his own rules without answering to anyone. What he never acknowledged, even to himself in the quietest hours of night watch, was the hollow ache that no amount of whiskey or hard riding could fill, the longing for something he couldn't name and didn't believe existed anymore. The liveryman, a grizzled fellow with a tobacco-stained beard, took his mare with a grunt. "Staying long?" "Just passing through," Owen replied, the words as automatic as breathing. "Heading up to the Hayden ranch tomorrow to see about work for the season." "Hayden's run a good outfit," the man said, eyeing Owen's worn but well-kept saddle and the quality of his firearms. "They might be hiring, what with the trouble they've been having." Owen's interest sharpened. Trouble. "Rustlers may be missing cattle, could be nothing, could be something," the liveryman shrugged. "Town's been seeing strange faces lately. Folks keeping to themselves." This was nothing new. The West was built on troubles, on men taking what wasn't theirs, on the constant struggle between civilization and lawlessness. Owen nodded his thanks for the information and headed toward the hotel, his saddlebag slung over one shoulder, rifle in hand. He'd check in, clean up, get a meal, and then maybe sample whatever passed for whiskey at the local saloon. In the morning, he'd head out to the Hayden place and see about work. The hotel lobby was dim and cool after the brightness of the street. A middle-aged woman with tired eyes looked up from her ledger as the door opened, assessing Owen with a practiced gaze. "Room for the night," he said, placing coins on the counter. "Sign here," she replied, turning the book toward him. "Supper's at 6 in the dining room, hot baths extra." As Owen scratched his name into the register, the door behind the counter opened, and the world shifted beneath his feet. She couldn't have been more than 22, with hair the color of wheat in late summer, pulled back in a simple knot at the nape of her neck. Her dress was plain but well-made cornflower blue calico that matched eyes a shade darker than his own. She carried a stack of fresh linens, and when she saw Owen, she paused, those remarkable eyes widening slightly. "Katherine," the older woman said, "room 4 needs preparing for Mr. Quincy here." The young woman, Katherine, nodded, her composure returning quickly. "Of course, mother." Her voice was low and pleasant, with a musical quality that suggested she might sing well. She offered Owen a small, professional smile. "Your room will be ready in just a few minutes, sir." Owen found himself nodding, unable to form words as she disappeared up the stairs. Something about her had struck him like a physical blow, not just her beauty, which was considerable, but a sense of recognition. No, that wasn't possible. He'd never been to Columbine Springs before. "My daughter runs this place more than I do these days," the woman said with a hint of pride. "Don't know what I'd do without her since her father passed." "You're fortunate to have her," Owen managed, taking the key she held out. "Room 4, top of the stairs to your right. Bathhouse is out back if you're interested." Owen thanked her and climbed the stairs, suddenly very aware of his trail-dusty appearance and the fact that his last proper bath had been over a week ago. He found himself hoping he wouldn't cross paths with Katherine again until he'd had a chance to clean up, a thought that irritated him the moment it formed. What did it matter what some hotel girl thought of him? He'd be gone within days, as always. The room was small but clean, with a narrow bed, washstand, and window overlooking the main street. Owen set his rifle in the corner, dropped his saddlebags on the bed, and crossed to the window. From this vantage point, he could see most of the town, including the sheriff's office and the saloon. Force of habit made him note the locations of alleys, potential cover, and the quickest route out of town if needed. A soft knock at the door interrupted his assessment. Owen's hand went automatically to the revolver on his hip before he caught himself. "Yes," he called. "Fresh towels, Mr. Quincy." Catherine's voice came through the door. Owen crossed the room in 2 strides and opened the door. Katherine stood there, a stack of neatly folded white towels in her arms, her eyes even more striking up close. "Thank you," he said, taking the towels, careful not to let their fingers touch. "Supper will be ready soon," she said. "We have beef stew tonight, it's quite good." Her smile was small but genuine, revealing a dimple in her right cheek. "I'll be down shortly," Owen replied, suddenly aware that he was staring. He stepped back, ready to close the door. Katherine hesitated, then asked, "Are you staying in Columbine Springs long, Mr. Quincy?" The question was innocent enough, but something in her tone caught his attention. Interest, concern, he couldn't quite place it. "Just passing through," he said, the familiar words feeling strangely inadequate. "Heading to the Hayden ranch tomorrow to look for work." A shadow passed over her face, so quickly he might have imagined it. "The Haydens are good people," she said after a brief pause. "I hope you find what you're looking for there." Before Owen could respond, she turned and headed back down the hallway, leaving him with the curious sensation that there was more behind her words than simple pleasantry. He closed the door and stood for a moment, the towels still in his hands, troubled by his reaction to a woman he'd just met. "Focus, Quincy," he muttered to himself. "You're not here for distractions." After a bath that washed away the worst of the trail dust, Owen dressed in his cleanest shirt and headed down to the dining room. It was a modest space with 6 tables, only 2 of which were occupied, one by a traveling salesman type in a slightly too fine suit, the other by an older couple who barely looked up from their meal. Katherine was serving, moving between tables with graceful efficiency. She noticed Owen immediately and gestured to a table near the window. "Mr. Quincy," she said, approaching with a steaming bowl of stew and a plate of bread. "I hope you found everything to your satisfaction upstairs." "Yes, thank you," he replied, settling into the chair. The stew smelled better than anything he'd eaten in weeks, rich with beef and vegetables. Katherine placed the food before him, then poured coffee from a pot she carried in her other hand. "Will you be wanting anything else?" Owen looked up at her, struck again by her composed beauty. Something about her seemed at odds with this small hotel in this small town, a quality of refinement, perhaps, or education. "This is plenty, thank you, miss," he let the question hang. "Holt," she supplied. "Katherine Holt." "Thank you, Miss Holt." She nodded and moved away to tend to the other diners, leaving Owen to his meal. He ate slowly, savoring real food after days of trail rations, and found his eyes following Katherine as she worked. There was a story there, he was certain, in the way she carried herself, in the glimpses of intelligence in her eyes, in the careful way she spoke. But it wasn't his story to know, he reminded himself. He would be gone soon enough. After dinner, Owen headed to the saloon, more out of habit than desire. The Silverhorn Saloon was like 100 others he'd seen, the long bar, the scattered tables, the small stage where a piano player pounded out familiar tunes. The usual collection of cowboys, miners, and local men filled the space, their voices creating a constant rumble beneath the music and the clink of glasses. Owen ordered whiskey and found a corner table where he could sit with his back to the wall and observe the room. The whiskey was better than he'd expected, and he sipped it slowly, letting the warmth spread through him. He was contemplating whether to join a poker game when the saloon doors swung open and 3 men entered. Something about them immediately put Owen on alert. They moved with the swagger of men who were used to creating space around themselves through intimidation, their eyes scanning the room with predatory assessment rather than casual interest. The tallest wore a gun tied down low on his thigh, the mark of a man who used his weapon professionally rather than just for show. The bartender's face tightened when he saw them, but he served their drinks without comment. The piano player's tempo faltered for just a beat before continuing. Small tells, but Owen noticed them, filing away the information. These men weren't welcome, but they weren't being confronted either. "Heard there's good work at the Hayden place," one of them said loudly, clearly meant to be overheard. "Might ride out there tomorrow, see what's what." Owen kept his expression neutral, but his interest sharpened. These didn't look like men looking for honest ranch work. Heard they're missing cattle too, said another with a mean laugh. Shame how that happens. The third man, the one with the tied-down gun, said nothing, but his eyes roamed the room until they settled on Owen. Their gazes locked for a brief moment before Owen deliberately looked away, pretending disinterest. The last thing he needed was trouble before he even got to the Hayden ranch. Owen finished his drink, left money on the table, and headed back to the hotel. The night air was cool and clear, stars brilliant in the vast blackness above the town. As he approached the hotel, he noticed a light still burning in the window of what must be the back office. Through the gap in the curtains, he could see Katherine sitting at a desk, her head bent over what appeared to be account books. As he watched, she paused in her work and reached into a drawer, withdrawing something small that he couldn't quite see. She glanced toward the door, checking to ensure she was alone, he realized, before looking down at whatever she held. Even from this distance, Owen could see her expression soften, a mixture of longing and sadness crossing her features. Feeling like an intruder, Owen moved to continue to the hotel entrance when Katherine suddenly looked up, as if sensing his presence. He stepped quickly into the shadows, but not before seeing her hurriedly tuck whatever she'd been looking at into a pocket of her dress. Owen entered the hotel quietly, nodding to Mrs. Holt, who sat dozing in a chair behind the front desk. He climbed the stairs to his room, troubled by what he'd seen without quite knowing why. Whatever Katherine had been looking at was clearly precious to her and private. It was none of his business. And yet, as he lay on the narrow bed staring at the ceiling, Owen couldn't shake the image of Katherine's face in that unguarded moment, or the feeling that there was something important he was missing. Morning came with the sounds of the town stirring to life. Owen dressed, packed his few belongings, and headed downstairs. The dining room was filled with the smell of coffee and bacon, and several tables were already occupied by early risers. Katherine was there, fresh and composed in a different dress, this one a soft green that brought out the blue of her eyes. She smiled when she saw him, and Owen felt an unexpected lightening in his chest. "Good morning, Mr. Quincy," she said. "Breakfast." "Please," he replied, taking the same table as the night before. She brought him a plate loaded with eggs, bacon, and biscuits, along with a cup of strong coffee. "Are you still planning to ride out to the Haydens today?" "That's my plan," Owen confirmed, noticing again that slight tension around her eyes at the mention of the ranch. Katherine hesitated, then said in a lower voice, "Be careful out there, Mr. Quincy. There's been trouble in these parts lately." "What kind of trouble?" She glanced around to ensure no one was listening. "Just men who don't respect boundaries, property lines, the law." Her eyes met his directly. "Men who take what isn't theirs." Before Owen could ask more, the front door of the hotel opened, and the tall man from the saloon strode in. His cold gaze swept the room before landing on Katherine, who stiffened almost imperceptibly. "Miss Holt," he said, removing his hat with exaggerated courtesy that didn't reach his eyes. "Fine morning." "Mr. Ross," she acknowledged with a tight nod. "What brings you to the hotel?" "Just thought I'd check on the prettiest lady in town before heading out to the Hayden place." His smile was all teeth. "Shame how they keep losing stock. Man might wonder if they can keep that ranch going much longer." "I'm sure they'll manage," Katherine replied, her voice cool. "The Haydens are resilient." Ross's eyes narrowed slightly at her tone. "Everyone breaks eventually, Miss Holt. It's just a matter of finding the right pressure." He glanced at Owen, a calculating assessment. "You heading that way too, stranger?" Owen met his gaze evenly. "Maybe." Ross smiled again, that same empty gesture. "Might see you on the trail then." He settled his hat back on his head, nodded to Katherine, and left as abruptly as he'd arrived. The moment the door closed behind him, Katherine exhaled slowly. Owen could see the tension in her shoulders, the slight tremor in her hand as she refilled his coffee cup. "Friend of yours?" Owen asked quietly. "Hardly," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "Victor Ross and his men have been making trouble since they arrived 3 months ago. They claim to work for the Western Cattlemen's Association, but," she trailed off, shaking her head. "But you don't believe them," Owen finished for her. Katherine's eyes met his, searching. "No," she said finally, "I don't. And neither does Sheriff Morris, but he can't prove anything. They're careful." Owen nodded, understanding the situation all too well. It was a story he'd seen play out across the West, powerful interests using whatever means necessary to acquire land, water rights, or cattle, intimidating smaller ranchers until they sold out or were ruined. "What's your connection to the Haydens?" he asked, surprising himself with the directness of the question. Katherine stiffened slightly. "They're good people," she said, her answer careful. "This town needs families like them to survive." It wasn't a full answer, and they both knew it. Owen wanted to press further but held back. He had no right to her confidences, and whatever her connection to the Hayden ranch was, it wasn't his concern. He'd be moving on soon enough. I should get going, he said, finishing his coffee and standing. Thank you for the meal, Miss Holt, and the warning. Mr. Quincy, she said as he turned to leave, if you do take work with the Haydens. Be careful, Ross and his men don't make idle threats. Owen nodded, touched by her concern. I've dealt with his kind before. I believe you have, she said softly, and something in her tone made him wonder what she saw when she looked at him. What experience or knowledge allowed her to make such an assessment? Owen paid his bill, collected his mare from the livery, and rode out of town with the morning sun at his back. The directions to the Hayden ranch were simple enough. Follow the creek north for about 10 miles, then east at the fork until he saw the ranch house in the valley below the ridge. As he rode, Owen found his thoughts returning to Katherine Holt and the mystery surrounding her. She clearly had some stake in what happened at the Hayden ranch, beyond the general welfare of the town. And there was the matter of whatever she'd been looking at the night before, something private and precious enough that she'd hidden it away at the first sign of being observed. None of it should matter to him. He was passing through, as always, taking work where he could find it, moving on when restlessness or trouble found him, as it inevitably did. Attachment was a luxury he couldn't afford, hadn't afforded himself since the war, since finding his family's homestead burned to the ground with his parents inside. And yet, Catherine's face kept appearing in his mind's eye, and the warning in her voice echoed in his thoughts. Be careful out there, Mr. Quincy. The Hayden ranch came into view just before noon, a substantial spread with a well-built main house, a large barn, bunkhouse, and corrals. Cattle grazed on the surrounding grassland, and in the distance, Owen could see riders moving among the herd. It was a prosperous operation, the kind that would indeed attract the attention of larger interests looking to expand their holdings. As Owen approached the main house, a man emerged onto the porch, tall, broad-shouldered, with graying hair and the weathered face of someone who'd spent decades under the western sun. He watched Owen's approach with the wary assessment of a man who'd recently had trouble. Something I can help you with, he called as Owen reined in his mare. Name's Owen Quincy, Owen replied, remaining mounted until invited to dismount, frontier courtesy in uncertain times. Heard you might be hiring. The man's expression remained guarded. Who told you that? Liveryman in town said you've been having some trouble, might need extra hands. The rancher's face hardened. News travels fast. He studied Owen for a long moment before nodding. I'm James Hayden. We could use another good man if you know cattle work. Worked cattle since I was old enough to sit a horse, Owen said. Drove herds up from Texas, worked ranches from Wyoming to Arizona. Hayden nodded, apparently satisfied. Step down then. We can talk terms. Owen dismounted, looping his reins around the hitching post. As he followed Hayden into the house, he noted the quality of the furnishings, solid, well-crafted, with touches that spoke of a woman's influence. There were photographs on the walls, books on shelves, a piano in one corner of the main room. Coffee, Hayden offered, gesturing to a chair at the kitchen table. Thank you, Owen said, removing his hat as he sat. Hayden poured 2 cups from the pot on the stove and sat across from Owen. So what brings you to these parts, Mr. Quincy? Just passing through looking for work, Owen replied with his standard answer. Heard Colorado was good country. It is, Hayden agreed, when folks respect boundaries and the law. His expression darkened. Been having problems with cattle disappearing. Small numbers at first, easy to write off as strays or predators, but it's getting worse. The Western Cattlemen's Association, Owen asked, recalling Catherine's words. Hayden's eyes sharpened. You've heard of them already. Met one of their representatives in town this morning, Ross. Hayden's hand tightened around his coffee cup. Victor Ross is no cattleman. He's a hired gun with fancy papers and men who do whatever he says. They've been pressuring every smaller ranch in the area to sell out. Those that refuse start having bad luck. And the law. Sheriff Morris is a good man, but he's one against many, and Ross is careful. Nothing that can be proven, Hayden sighed, the weight of months of pressure evident in his posture. I've sent for help, but until then we're short-handed and vulnerable. I need men I can trust to watch the herds, especially at night. I can do that, Owen said. Hayden studied him again as if trying to see beneath the surface. Why should I trust you, Mr. Quincy? You're a stranger who rode in at a mighty convenient time. It was a fair question. Owen met the older man's gaze directly. I fought for the Union, Mr. Hayden, lost my family to raiders who thought they could take what wasn't theirs. I don't much care for men like Ross." He paused, "and Miss Holt at the hotel seems to think highly of you." Something shifted in Hayden's expression at the mention of Katherine, surprise, followed by what might have been relief. "You've met Katherine." "Stayed at the hotel last night," Owen confirmed. "She mentioned you were good people." Hayden's posture relaxed slightly. "If Katherine vouched for you, that's good enough for me." "She's a fine judge of character." He extended his hand across the table. "The job's yours if you want it, Mr. Quincy. 40 a month plus room and board in the bunkhouse." Owen shook his hand. "When do I start?" "Right now," Hayden said, rising from the table. "I'll introduce you to the foreman, get you settled." As they walked toward the door, Owen's eyes were drawn to a photograph on the mantel, a family portrait showing a younger James Hayden, a woman who must be his wife, and between them, a girl of perhaps 15 or 16 with wheat blonde hair and familiar blue eyes. Owen stopped, staring at the image. The girl was unmistakably Katherine Holt, though younger than the woman he'd met in town. The background of the photograph showed the very house he was standing in, the distinctive porch visible behind the family group. "That's my wife Elizabeth," Hayden said, noticing Owen's attention to the photograph. "She passed 5 years ago, and my daughter." Owen turned to him, pieces falling into place. "Your daughter," he repeated. "Katherine." Hayden's expression grew complex, pride mixed with sadness and something like regret. "Katherine Hayden, yes, though she goes by Holt in town now." "Why?" Owen asked before he could stop himself. Hayden sighed heavily. "That's a long story, Mr. Quincy, and not mine alone to tell. For now, let's get you settled and working. There'll be time for stories later." As Owen followed Hayden out to meet the ranch hands, his mind was racing. Katherine Holt was Katherine Hayden, the daughter of the rancher, living under a different name in town, keeping her connection to the ranch hidden. But why? What possible reason could she have for concealing her identity? The photograph he'd glimpsed her hiding the night before, had it been this family portrait? And if so, why keep it secret? Owen had come to the Hayden ranch looking for temporary work, expecting nothing more than the usual routine of cattle, horses, and men. Instead, he'd stumbled into what was clearly a complicated situation involving a woman who had already begun to occupy more of his thoughts than was wise. "Be careful out there, Mr. Quincy." Katherine's warning took on new meaning now. She hadn't just been warning him about Ross and his men, she'd been warning him about becoming involved in her family's troubles. But as Owen rode out with the foreman to check the eastern boundary of the ranch, he realized it was already too late for that warning. Whatever was happening here, he was now part of it. And for reasons he couldn't fully explain, the thought of leaving didn't cross his mind. The next few days established a rhythm. Owen worked from dawn to dusk, proving his worth through his skill with horses and cattle, his sharp eyes, and his willingness to take the night watch that many of the other hands avoided. James Hayden was a fair employer who worked alongside his men, and the other hands were a decent lot, wary of the newcomer at first, but accepting once they saw he carried his weight. The foreman, a taciturn man named Miller who had worked for the Haydens for 15 years, eventually filled in some of the gaps in Owen's understanding. "Miss Katherine left for school back east after her mother died," Miller explained as they rode fence line on Owen's third day. "Came back educated, ready to take her place helping run the ranch. But then these vultures from the Cattlemen's Association showed up." "And she went to town instead," Owen prompted when Miller fell silent. "Mr. Hayden's idea," Miller said, his voice low even though there was no one else around for miles. "After the first threats came, thought she'd be safer there, away from the ranch, using her mother's maiden name to keep the connection quiet." He spat to the side. "Ross is the type to use any leverage he can find. A man's daughter would be mighty tempting leverage. So she runs the hotel while her father fights to keep the ranch," Owen said, understanding dawning. "And no one in town knows they're related. Only Sheriff Morris and the Holts who own the hotel, old friends of Mrs. Hayden's family. Everyone else thinks she's their niece from Denver." Miller adjusted his hat. "Been hard on them both, they're close, always were, and Miss Katherine's got ranching in her blood, living in town pretending to be someone else. It wears on her." Owen thought of Katherine's face when she'd looked at the hidden photograph, the longing and sadness he'd glimpsed. It made sense now, she wasn't just hiding her identity. She was separated from her home and her father, unable to help directly in their struggle against Ross and his men. "Why doesn't Hayden sell?" Owen asked. "Start fresh somewhere else?" Miller looked at him sharply. "This land's been in the family since '58. Mr. Hayden's father broke the first soil, built the first cabin. Mrs. Hayden is buried on that ridge over there. He pointed to a small rise where a single tree stood sentinel. This isn't just property to them, it's home. Owen nodded, understanding all too well. His own family had felt the same way about their homestead in Missouri, had died rather than abandon it. The West was filled with such stories, men and women who put down roots so deep that even the harshest conditions couldn't dislodge them. Besides, Miller continued, selling wouldn't solve anything. Ross and his kind would just move on to the next target. Someone has to stand against them, or they'll own everything from here to the mountains. The conversation stayed with Owen that night as he took his turn at watch, riding the perimeter of the closest pasture where the most valuable breeding stock grazed. The night was clear, stars scattered across the vast darkness like diamonds on black velvet, the air cool enough to see his breath. It was the kind of night that usually reinforced Owen's belief that the frontier was best faced alone, the immensity of the landscape making human connections seem transient and fragile in comparison. But tonight, his thoughts kept returning to Katherine and her father, to their determination to hold onto what was theirs despite the threats and pressure. There was courage in that kind of commitment, not just to the land but to each other. A different kind of strength than the solitary self-reliance Owen had cultivated since the war. A sound to his right snapped Owen back to alertness. He reined his horse to a stop, listening intently. There it was again, the soft clink of metal against metal, too deliberate to be natural. Someone was out there in the darkness, trying to move quietly. Owen drew his revolver and guided his mare off the trail into the shadow of a stand of cottonwoods. From this vantage point, he could see a portion of the pasture fence and the cattle beyond, dark shapes against the lighter ground. 3 riders emerged from the trees on the far side of the fence. They moved with purpose, heading directly toward the cattle. Even in the dim starlight, Owen recognized the lead rider. The distinctive silhouette of Victor Ross was unmistakable. Owen watched as they cut 4 head from the herd and began driving them toward a section of fence. One rider dismounted and worked at the fence, cutting it, Owen realized, to make it appear the cattle had broken through. This wasn't a large-scale rustling operation. This was calculated harassment, taking just enough cattle to cause financial strain, making it look like an accident or poor management. Death by 1,000 cuts rather than a single killing blow. Owen could engage them, he was a good shot and he had surprise on his side. But 3 against 1 were poor odds, especially when the 3 included Victor Ross, whose reputation as a gunman was likely well earned. Instead, Owen remained hidden, memorizing details, the distinctive markings of their horses, the direction they headed with the stolen cattle, the exact location of the cut fence. Evidence that might finally give Sheriff Morris something to act on. Once the rustlers were gone, Owen rode quickly back to the ranch. Despite the late hour, lights still burned in the main house. Hayden himself answered Owen's knock, rifle in hand. "Quincy, what is it?" Owen quickly related what he'd seen. Hayden's face hardened as he listened, his knuckles white around the rifle. "Brazen," he muttered when Owen finished. Getting bolder, he reached for his hat. "Show me." They rode out together, Hayden grim and silent beside him. At the cut fence, they examined the clean cuts in the wire, professional work designed to look like strain breakage to the casual observer. "They're driving them east," Owen said, pointing to the tracks visible in the soft earth. "Toward that box canyon near the creek." Hayden nodded, temporary holding spot. "They'll move them again before dawn, likely to one of the association's properties where they'll be mixed with other cattle and impossible to identify." "We could track them now," Owen suggested. "Catch them in the act." Hayden considered this, then shook his head. "Too risky." Ross would claim they were just retrieving strays that broke through our poorly maintained fence, and if it came to violence, he didn't need to finish the thought. Without witnesses or clear evidence, a confrontation could easily be twisted against them. "We need the law," Hayden said finally. "This time we have specific details, times, locations, numbers. Morris can't ignore that." He turned to Owen. "Ride into town at first light, find the sheriff, tell him what you saw. I'll have the men repair the fence and check the rest of the boundary." Owen nodded, though he wondered if involving the law would really make a difference. In his experience, justice on the frontier was often more aspiration than reality, especially when power and money were involved. They returned to the ranch, and Owen managed a few hours of sleep before dawn broke clear and cold. He saddled his mare and rode for town as the first golden light spilled over the eastern hills, illuminating the landscape in shades of amber and rose. Columbine Springs was just coming to life when Owen arrived. shopkeepers unlocking doors, the blacksmith's forge already glowing, the smell of bread baking somewhere down the street. He headed straight for the sheriff's office, but found it empty. A note on the door indicating Sheriff Morris had ridden out to investigate a disturbance at the Peterson farm and would return by noon. Frustrated by the delay but unable to do anything about it, Owen decided to wait at the hotel. He hadn't seen Katherine since leaving for the ranch 4 days ago, and the prospect of seeing her again created a curious anticipation that he tried to dismiss as simple friendliness. The hotel dining room was busy with the breakfast crowd when he entered. Katherine was moving between tables, coffee pot in hand, her blonde hair neatly pinned up, her green dress setting off the color of her eyes. She saw Owen immediately, and he couldn't miss the way her face brightened before she composed herself into a more measured welcome. "Mr. Quincy," she said as he took a seat at an empty table. "We didn't expect to see you back so soon." "Business in town," Owen replied, keeping his voice casual for the benefit of the other diners. "Need to speak with the sheriff when he returns." Katherine's eyes sharpened with concern. "Is everything all right at the ranch? She caught herself. "The Haydens." "Everyone's fine," he assured her quickly. "Just some information that needs to be shared." Relief washed over her features. "I'm glad to hear it." She poured his coffee with a steady hand. "The usual breakfast." "Please," Owen said. As she turned to go, he added quietly, "I know Miss Holt. About your connection to the ranch." Katherine froze, her back to him, then slowly turned around. Her face had paled slightly. "Who told you?" "No one needed to," he replied softly. "I saw the photograph on the mantel." "And you have your father's eyes." She glanced around to ensure no one was listening, then leaned closer. "We should talk, but not here. Meet me in the hotel office in 20 minutes. Owen nodded, and she moved away to the kitchen. He sipped his coffee, considering what he would say to her. The deception bothered him less than the danger it implied. If Ross was ruthless enough that Katherine needed to hide her identity, then the threat to the Hayden ranch was even more serious than he'd initially understood. Katherine brought his breakfast a few minutes later, professional and composed, giving no indication of their planned meeting. Owen ate quickly, his mind on the coming conversation and the information he needed to share with the sheriff. At the appointed time, Owen made his way to the small office at the back of the hotel. Katherine was waiting for him, her expression guarded but resolute. "Close the door," she said as he entered. Owen did so, then turned to face her. In the light of day, the office was revealed as a tidy space with a desk, filing cabinet, and small bookshelf. A window looked out onto a garden area behind the hotel, providing natural light. "You've been to the ranch," Katherine said, not a question but a statement. "You've met my father." "Yes," Owen confirmed. "He hired me 4 days ago." "And now you're in town to see the sheriff," she continued, connecting the dots. "Something happened." Owen told her about the rustling he'd witnessed, keeping his account factual and concise. Katherine listened intently, her composure slipping only when he described the calculated nature of the thefts. "They're trying to bleed him dry," she said when he finished, anger and frustration evident in her voice. "Small losses that add up, damages that require money and manpower to repair, pressure that never lets up." She paced to the window and back. "It's been going on for months." "Why haven't you gone to the law before?" Owen asked. "We have," Katherine replied, "but Ross is careful. Nothing that can be proven conclusively, nothing that can't be explained away as accidents or normal ranch losses." She looked at him directly. "Until now, you're an eyewitness, Mr. Quincy. That changes things." "Maybe," Owen allowed, not wanting to promise more than he could deliver. "If Sheriff Morris can catch them with the cattle, or find evidence at this holding place in the canyon." Katherine nodded, hope and skepticism warring in her expression. Then she sighed, gesturing to a chair as she took a seat behind the desk. "You must have questions." "A few," Owen admitted, sitting across from her. "Why the secrecy? Why are you living in town under your mother's maiden name?" Katherine's fingers traced a pattern on the desk's surface, a nervous gesture at odds with her usual composure. "When Ross and his men first came, they approached my father directly with an offer to buy the ranch. When he refused, they began applying pressure, subtle at first, then increasingly direct." She looked up, meeting Owen's gaze. "One day Ross came to the ranch when my father was out checking the north pasture. He found me alone in the house." Her voice remained steady, but Owen could see the memory still disturbed her. "He didn't touch me, but the threat was clear in everything he said, in the way he looked at me. He wanted me to understand that my father's continued resistance would have consequences, and that I might be one of them. Owen's hand tightened involuntarily on the arm of his chair, anger flaring hot at the thought of Ross threatening Katherine. My father was furious when I told him, Katherine continued. He wanted to confront Ross directly, but I convinced him that would only escalate the situation. Instead, we decided I would come to town, stay with my mother's cousins who run the hotel, use their name to hide my connection to the ranch. She smiled sadly. We thought it would be temporary, a few weeks at most, while my father gathered support from other ranchers, while Sheriff Morris built a case against Ross. But it's been months, Owen said. 3 months and 12 days, Katherine confirmed with precision that revealed how each day of separation had been counted. And instead of getting better, things have gotten worse. More ranches have sold to the association, more pressure on those who remain. She shook her head. And I'm stuck here, unable to help beyond keeping my ears open for information, unable even to visit my own home without risking drawing Ross's attention back to me. The frustration in her voice was palpable. This was a woman used to action, to participation, reduced to watching from a distance as her family's legacy was threatened. The photograph I saw you looking at the other night, Owen said. It was the one from the ranch, wasn't it? Katherine's eyes widened slightly in surprise. You saw that. Just that you were looking at something you didn't want others to see, he clarified. I didn't mean to intrude on your privacy. She held his gaze for a moment, then opened a drawer in the desk and withdrew a small framed photograph, a copy of the family portrait from the ranch. I keep it hidden because it would raise too many questions, she explained, looking down at the image with visible longing. But sometimes I need to remember who I really am. The vulnerability in her admission touched Owen deeply. He understood what it meant to hold on to pieces of your true self when circumstances forced you to become someone else, to wear a mask for survival. Your father is a good man, he said after a moment. He speaks of you with pride. Katherine's eyes brightened with unshed tears that she quickly blinked away. He's the strongest person I know, she said softly, not just physically but here. She placed a hand over her heart. He taught me that some things are worth fighting for, no matter the cost. The door to the office opened suddenly, startling them both. Mrs. Holt, Katherine's supposed aunt, stood in the doorway, her expression apologetic but urgent. Katherine, Sheriff Morris is back, and he's not alone, she glanced at Owen. Ross and 2 of his men are with him. They're asking questions about Mr. Quincy here. Katherine stood immediately, her manner shifting from the vulnerable woman of moments before to someone more guarded. Where are they now? Outside the sheriff's office. One of Ross's men saw Mr. Quincy arrive in town and reported it to Ross. Mrs. Holt's concern was evident. They seem quite interested in why he's here. Owen rose as well, his mind racing. Ross must have suspected he'd been observed the night before and moved quickly to control the situation. I need to speak with Sheriff Morris, he said, before Ross has a chance to spin the story. Be careful, Katherine warned. Ross wouldn't be here unless he already had a plan. Owen nodded, acknowledging the warning while also recognizing that he had little choice. If he didn't present his evidence now, Ross would ensure it was discredited before he could. Stay here, he told Katherine. There's no need for you to be involved. Katherine's expression hardened with determination. This is my father's ranch we're talking about, Mr. Quincy. I've been staying here for over 3 months while Ross and his men threaten everything my family has built. I'm coming with you. Owen wanted to argue but recognized the steel in her voice. This wasn't a woman who would be easily dissuaded once her mind was made up. All right, he conceded. But let me do the talking. They left the hotel together, walking the short distance to the sheriff's office. As they approached, Owen could see Sheriff Morris, a lean, weathered man with a salt and pepper mustache, standing on the boardwalk outside his office. With him were Ross and the 2 men Owen had seen at the saloon his first night in town. Ross spotted them first, his cold eyes narrowing as they fell on Owen, then shifting to Katherine with a speculative gleam that made Owen's hand instinctively move closer to his revolver. Mr. Quincy, Sheriff Morris called as they approached, I understand you've been looking for me. Yes, Sheriff, Owen replied, keeping his tone neutral as he climbed the steps to the boardwalk, Katherine beside him. I have information regarding some rustling activity at the Hayden ranch last night. Ross laughed, the sound devoid of humor. That's a serious accusation, stranger, especially coming from someone who just rode into town a few days ago and immediately took up with James Hayden. It's not an accusation, it's a report of what I witnessed, Owen clarified, looking directly at the sheriff rather than Ross. 4 head of breeding stock taken around midnight, fence cut to make it look like they broke through. I saw it happen. Sheriff Morris's expression remained carefully professional. That's a specific claim, Mr. Quincy. I'd like to hear the details inside. He gestured to the door of his office. I'm sure you would, Sheriff, Ross interrupted smoothly. But before we get to Mr. Quincy's imagination, perhaps we should discuss who exactly he is. His eyes fixed on Owen with malicious intent, because I have information suggesting he's not just a drifting cowhand looking for honest work. Katherine tensed beside Owen, clearly sensing the trap being laid. What are you implying, Ross? Sheriff Morris asked, his patience visibly wearing thin. Ross reached into his coat and withdrew a folded paper. This arrived from Denver yesterday, seems our Mr. Quincy here matches the description of a man wanted for questioning in connection with a shooting in Pueblo 2 months ago. Killed a man in a saloon, then disappeared. Owen kept his expression impassive, though inwardly he cursed. The Pueblo incident had been self-defense, a drunk cowboy looking for trouble, pulling a knife when Owen refused to be provoked. The local sheriff had told Owen he was free to go after witnesses confirmed his account. Apparently someone had decided to reopen the matter, or Ross had fabricated the connection entirely. That's convenient timing, Owen said evenly. A wanted notice arrives just after I witness you stealing Hayden cattle. Ross's face darkened. You're calling me a liar and a thief, Quincy. I'm stating facts, Owen replied, aware of how quickly the situation was escalating but unwilling to back down. 4 cattle midnight last night, East Pasture. You and 2 men cut the fence and drove them toward the Box Canyon. Sheriff, Katherine interjected, her voice calm but forceful. Mr. Quincy was hired by Mr. Hayden in good faith. Whatever Mr. Ross is suggesting about his past has nothing to do with what he witnessed last night. Ross turned his cold gaze on Katherine. Miss Holt, you seem awfully concerned about the Hayden Ranch for someone who's just a hotel manager. One might almost think you had a personal interest in the matter. The implied threat in his words was clear. He was hinting at Katherine's true identity, threatening to expose her if she continued to support Owen's claims. Sheriff Morris, who knew Katherine's secret, stepped in. That's enough, Ross. Miss Holt is a respected member of this community, and I won't have you impugning her character. He took the paper from Ross's hand. I'll look into this matter regarding Mr. Quincy. As for the rustling accusation, I'll ride out to the Hayden Ranch today to investigate. The cattle won't still be in that canyon, Owen pointed out. They'll have been moved by now. Then I suggest we go see for ourselves, Ross said with a thin smile. If there's stolen Hayden cattle in that canyon, I'll turn myself in. If not, he shrugged, perhaps Mr. Quincy's memory isn't as reliable as he claims. It was a challenge Owen couldn't refuse without appearing to back down from his accusation. Yet he knew the canyon would be empty. Ross was too smart to leave evidence behind. I'll go with you, Owen said, show you exactly where I saw them taking the cattle. And I'll need statements from both of you, Sheriff Morris added, official documentation of these claims. Ross nodded, his confidence suggesting he had nothing to fear from official scrutiny. Whatever you need, Sheriff, the Western Cattlemen's Association has nothing to hide. The tension on the boardwalk was palpable, the confrontation having drawn a small crowd of onlookers from the surrounding businesses. Katherine stood resolute beside Owen, her presence both a comfort and a concern. He didn't want her more deeply involved in what was becoming an increasingly dangerous situation. Katherine, a new voice called from the street. Everyone turned to see James Hayden dismounting from his horse, his expression grim as he took in the tableau before him. Katherine's composure slipped for just a moment, relief and concern warring in her features. Father, she said, the word escaping before she could stop herself. A murmur ran through the onlookers. Ross's smile widened with malicious satisfaction. Well, well, he drawled, the secret's out, it seems. Miss Katherine Hayden playing at being Miss Holt all this time. Hayden strode forward, ignoring Ross to stand beside his daughter. Are you all right? He asked her quietly. I'm fine, she assured him. But what are you doing here? It's not safe. Miller saw riders heading this way at dawn, Hayden explained. Recognized Ross's man. I was worried he'd figured out who you were. He looked from Katherine to Owen. I see I was right to be concerned. Ross stepped forward, his hand resting casually near his holstered revolver. Touching family reunion, he said. though I must say, Hayden, hiding your daughter away under a false name. What were you afraid of? You know exactly what I was afraid of, Ross, Hayden replied, his voice hard. The same thing every decent rancher in this valley fears, your kind of business practices. The situation was deteriorating rapidly, the public confrontation drawing more attention than was safe for any of them. Sheriff Morris seemed to realize this too. Inside, all of you, he ordered, gesturing to his office. This isn't a public spectacle. As they moved to comply, Owen caught Catherine's eye. The fear he saw there wasn't for herself but for her father and for him, fear that Ross had maneuvered them into a position where truth would matter less than perception, where justice would bow to power. Inside the sheriff's office, the atmosphere was tense as Morris took statements from Owen and Ross about the events of the previous night. Ross's account was smooth, practiced. He'd been at the saloon until 10, then returned to the association's headquarters ranch. His men corroborated his story, providing alibi for each other in a way that was technically flawless but rang false to everyone in the room. Owen told the truth simply and directly, what he'd seen, when and where, the specific details that couldn't have been invented. Hayden confirmed the missing cattle, the cut fence, the tracks leading east toward the canyon. It seems we have contradicting accounts, Sheriff Morris said when everyone had spoken. The only way to resolve this is to check the canyon where Mr. Quincy claims the cattle were taken. They won't be there anymore, Owen repeated. Ross would have moved them by dawn. Then we'll look for signs they were there, Morris replied. Tracks, droppings, disturbed ground, cattle leave evidence. Ross shrugged, maintaining his facade of innocent cooperation. Whatever you need to do, Sheriff, but while we're settling this matter, what about the warrant from Pueblo? He nodded toward the paper on Morris's desk. Seems to me a man accused of killing someone shouldn't be walking free. Morris picked up the paper, studying it carefully. This isn't a warrant, Ross. It's a notice requesting information on a man matching Mr. Quincy's general description in connection with a shooting. It doesn't name him specifically, and it doesn't order his arrest. He set the paper down. I'll wire Pueblo for clarification, but I see no reason to detain Mr. Quincy based on this. Ross's expression darkened momentarily before he regained his composure. As you wish, Sheriff. But I hope you'll keep a close eye on him, for the safety of the community. The implied threat wasn't lost on anyone in the room. Owen remained outwardly calm, but inwardly he was calculating possibilities, risks, and countermoves. Ross was dangerous, more so now that he'd been publicly challenged. The situation had escalated beyond the point where either side could easily back down. I propose we ride to the canyon now, Sheriff Morris said. Mr. Hayden, Mr. Quincy, and myself, Mr. Ross, you're welcome to join us if you wish. Oh, I wouldn't miss it, Ross replied with a cold smile. I'm quite interested in seeing this evidence. Katherine stepped forward. I'm coming too. Katherine, no, her father said immediately. It's too dangerous. I've been hiding for months, father, she replied, her voice firm. I won't hide anymore, not when everything we care about is at stake. The determination in her eyes was unmistakable. Owen recognized it as the same quality he'd seen in James Hayden, a refusal to yield what was important, regardless of the risk. Like father, like daughter. Hayden looked like he wanted to argue further but finally nodded, respecting his daughter's choice even as concern lined his face. Stay close to me, was all he said. The ride to the canyon was tense. The group spread out along the trail, Sheriff Morris and Ross in the lead, followed by Ross's two men, then Owen, Katherine, and Hayden bringing up the rear. Owen kept a careful eye on Ross and his men, not trusting them to play fair now that they'd been directly accused. Katherine rode beside Owen for much of the journey, her posture straight, her expression determined despite the danger they were heading into. I'm sorry about this, Owen said quietly when they were far enough from the others not to be overheard. I never meant to expose your secret. It was bound to happen eventually, Katherine replied, her eyes on the trail ahead. And perhaps it's better this way. I was tired of hiding, of pretending to be someone I'm not, she glanced at him. Besides, you did the right thing, reporting what you saw. Few would have had that courage, knowing who they were accusing. It's not courage, Owen said, just stubbornness maybe. Or a dislike of men who think they can take whatever they want without consequences. Katherine studied him for a moment. You've faced men like Ross before. It wasn't a question, but Owen answered anyway. During the war, after. Men who use violence and intimidation to control others, who see strength only in dominance. He met her gaze. They can be beaten, it just takes people willing to stand against them. Is that why you stayed at the ranch? Katherine asked. To stand against them. Owen hesitated. The truth was more complicated than he wanted to admit. Yes, he'd stayed because he believed in standing against men like Ross, but also because something about the Haydens, about Katherine herself, had made him want to put down the burden of constant movement, of avoiding attachment. Your father offered me a job, he said finally. A fair wage for honest work, that's rare enough to be worth sticking around for. Katherine's slight smile suggested she heard what he wasn't saying, but she didn't press him further. Instead, she looked ahead to where the trail narrowed as it approached the canyon entrance. We're almost there, she said, her voice taking on a tension that reflected the gravity of what was at stake. The box canyon was a natural corral, with high rock walls on three sides and a narrow entrance that could be easily blocked or guarded. It was an ideal temporary holding place for stolen cattle, isolated, defensible, with a small spring providing water. As Owen had predicted, the canyon was empty when they arrived. Ross made a show of looking around with exaggerated innocence, spreading his hands wide. Well, Sheriff, I don't see any stolen Hayden cattle here. Just as I said. Owen dismounted and began examining the ground, Sheriff Morris following his lead. The soil was soft enough to hold impressions, and Owen quickly found what he was looking for: multiple hoof prints, fresh droppings, areas where cattle had clearly bedded down for a few hours. They were here, Owen said, pointing to the evidence. At least 4 head, held overnight and moved out early this morning. Sheriff Morris knelt to examine the tracks. These are fresh, he confirmed. Within the past 24 hours. Ross remained mounted, looking down at them with contempt. This proves nothing. Any cattle could have been here, strays, wild stock, or maybe Hayden himself brought them here to fabricate evidence. These have my brand, Hayden said sharply, pointing to a distinct hoof print where the pressure had left the impression of a branded hide against the soft earth. And the tracks lead in from my east pasture, just as Quincy described. Ross's expression hardened as the evidence mounted against him. His 2 companions shifted nervously, hands drifting closer to their weapons. Sheriff Morris, Ross said, his voice dangerously quiet, are you really going to take the word of a drifter with a questionable past and a rancher desperate to blame someone for his own mismanagement over a representative of the Western Cattlemen's Association? Morris stood, brushing dirt from his knees. I'm going to follow the evidence, Ross, and right now the evidence supports Mr. Quincy's account. The tension in the canyon was thick enough to cut with a knife. Owen was acutely aware of Katherine and her father standing exposed, of the narrowness of the canyon entrance that could easily become a trap. I suggest we continue this discussion back in town, Sheriff Morris said, clearly sensing the dangerous undercurrent. Mr. Ross, I'll need you and your men to come to my office to answer some additional questions. Ross laughed, the sound echoing off the canyon walls. I don't think so, Sheriff. I think we've played along with this charade long enough. His hand moved to his revolver. The association wants the Hayden Ranch, and they're going to get it, one way or another. Everything happened at once. Owen dove for Katherine, pulling her behind a large boulder as Ross drew his weapon. Sheriff Morris reached for his own gun, but one of Ross's men was faster, firing a shot that caught the sheriff in the shoulder, spinning him to the ground. James Hayden, who had been examining tracks on the far side of the canyon, shouted and ran toward his daughter, drawing the attention of the second gunman. A shot rang out, and Hayden stumbled but kept moving, determination driving him forward despite the blood now staining his side. Owen pushed Katherine further behind the boulder. Stay down, he ordered, then drew his revolver and fired at Ross, forcing him to take cover behind his horse. The animal reared in panic, nearly unseating its rider before bolting toward the canyon entrance. The firefight that followed was chaotic and deadly. Sheriff Morris, though wounded, managed to draw his weapon and fire from his position on the ground, striking one of Ross's men in the chest. The man fell from his horse, dead before he hit the ground. The second gunman tried to circle around to flank Owen in Katherine's position, but James Hayden, despite his wound, intercepted him. The 2 men struggled briefly before Hayden's greater strength prevailed, allowing him to disarm his opponent with a powerful blow. Ross, seeing his advantage slipping away, took aim at Katherine where she was partially visible behind the boulder. Owen saw the movement and fired simultaneously with Ross. Owen's bullet struck Ross in the shooting arm, causing his shot to go wild, while Ross's bullet grazed Owen's shoulder, leaving a burning trail of pain. Wounded and now alone, Ross tried to flee, spurring his horse toward the canyon entrance. Owen raised his revolver for another shot but found Catherine's hand on his arm. "Not in the back," she said, her voice steady despite the terror of the past few minutes. "We're not like him." Owen lowered his weapon, acknowledging the wisdom in her words. Besides, Ross wouldn't get far, his arm was bleeding heavily, and the nearest friendly territory was miles away. The aftermath of the shootout was a blur of activity. Sheriff Morris, though wounded, took charge, securing the surviving gunman with handcuffs. James Hayden, pale but determined, allowed Katherine to bind his wound while insisting he was just grazed. Katherine herself moved with remarkable composure, tending first to her father, then to Sheriff Morris, and finally to Owen. Her hands were gentle but efficient as she cleaned and bandaged the furrow Ross's bullet had left along his shoulder. "You saved my life," she said softly as she worked, her eyes meeting his. "You'd have done the same," Owen replied, wincing slightly as she tightened the bandage. A small smile touched her lips. "Yes, I would have." The simple statement held a world of meaning, an acknowledgement of something growing between them, a recognition of shared values that went beyond the chaos of the day's events. Sheriff Morris managed to stand with assistance, his face gray with pain but his determination undiminished. "We need to get back to town," he said. "Doc Wilson needs to look at these wounds, and I want Ross's man locked up before any of his friends come looking for him." They fashioned a travois for the dead gunman and helped Sheriff Morris onto his horse. The surviving member of Ross's crew was secured on his own mount, hands bound to the saddle horn. The journey back to Columbine Springs was slow and painful, but there was a sense of victory underlying the discomfort. Ross had finally overplayed his hand, committing crimes that couldn't be explained away or dismissed. As they approached town, Owen rode alongside Katherine, watching her profile against the backdrop of the setting sun. She had shown remarkable courage throughout the ordeal, a strength of character that matched the beauty he'd first noticed at the hotel. "What happens now?" he asked quietly. Katherine turned to him, the fading light catching the gold in her hair. "Justice, hopefully. Ross will be hunted for attempted murder. His accomplice will testify to save himself. The association will distance themselves from rogue employees to avoid liability," she sighed. "It won't end their efforts to acquire land in the valley, but it might force them to use legal means rather than intimidation." "And you?" Owen asked, the question that mattered most to him. "Will you go back to the ranch?" A smile spread across her face, genuine and warm. "Yes, no more hiding, no more pretending to be someone I'm not." She studied him for a moment. "What about you, Mr. Quincy? Will you be just passing through as usual?" The question cut to the heart of the matter, to the decision Owen had been avoiding since he first rode into Columbine Springs. For years, he'd convinced himself that the frontier was no place for putting down roots, that connections were dangerous, that survival meant remaining unattached and ready to move on. But the events of the past week had challenged that belief at every turn. He'd seen the strength in the bonds between Katherine and her father, the power of a community standing against threats, the courage that came from fighting for something more meaningful than mere survival. And then there was Katherine herself, intelligent, brave, determined, and beautiful in ways that went far beyond her physical appearance. She represented everything he'd told himself he couldn't have, shouldn't want. Yet here she was, riding beside him, waiting for his answer with those remarkable blue eyes that seemed to see right through the barriers he'd built around himself. "I signed on for the season," he said finally, his voice rougher than he intended. "I don't break my word." Katherine raised an eyebrow, clearly hearing the evasion in his response. "The season ends with the first snow," she pointed out. "What then?" Owen looked ahead to the town now visible in the distance, then back to Katherine. "I don't know," he admitted. "For a long time, moving on was all I knew how to do, but now," he trailed off, struggling to articulate the change he felt within himself. "Now," Katherine prompted gently, "now I'm not so sure that's the right path anymore." It was as close as he could come to expressing the turmoil in his heart, the battle between old habits and new possibilities. Katherine nodded, seeming to understand what he couldn't quite say. "Well, Mr. Quincy, you have until the first snow to figure it out." Her smile returned, warming him more effectively than the setting sun. "And I have a feeling our Colorado winters might convince you there are worse things than staying in one place." The next few weeks brought significant changes to Columbine Springs and the surrounding valley. Victor Ross was captured 2 days after the canyon shootout, weakened by blood loss and exposure. His surviving henchmen, facing hanging, turned state's evidence against both Ross and the Western Cattlemen's Association, revealing a pattern of intimidation, theft, and violence that extended far beyond the Hayden Ranch. The resulting scandal forced the association to withdraw from the territory entirely. selling off the properties they'd acquired and dismissing the employees who had carried out their less legitimate activities. Ross himself was sentenced to 15 years in the territorial prison, effectively ending his career as a hired gun. For the Haydens, the resolution of the conflict brought long-awaited peace. James recovered from his wound and returned to full management of his ranch, no longer needing to maintain constant vigilance against sabotage and theft. Katherine moved back to her family home, though she continued to help at the hotel several days a week, honoring the bonds she'd formed with the Holts during her time there. As for Owen, he remained at the Hayden ranch, working alongside the other hands but gradually taking on more responsibility as James came to trust his judgment and skill. The barriers he'd built around himself didn't disappear overnight, but they began to crumble, stone by stone, as he allowed himself to form connections with the people around him. His relationship with Katherine evolved slowly, cautiously, both of them aware of the significance of what was developing between them. They began with rides across the ranch property on Owen's days off, Katherine showing him the places she'd loved since childhood, the aspen grove where she'd built a fort at 10 years old, the high meadow filled with wildflowers in summer, the sheltered valley where deer gathered at dawn and dusk. These excursions gave way to shared meals at the ranch house, where Owen discovered Katherine's talent for conversation and her surprising knowledge of literature and current events, gleaned from her education back east. James would join them sometimes, his initial wariness of Owen's interest in his daughter gradually giving way to approval as he recognized the honorable man beneath the drifter's exterior. As autumn painted the landscape in golds and reds, Owen and Katherine's feelings for each other became increasingly difficult to disguise or deny. Yet Owen still held back from full commitment, the old fear of vulnerability warring with his growing love for Katherine and the life he was building at the ranch. The first snow came earlier than expected, in late October, a gentle dusting that melted by noon but served as a reminder of the season's inevitable change. Owen stood on the porch of the bunkhouse that morning, watching the flakes drift down, aware that the moment of decision Katherine had referenced was rapidly approaching. That evening, as the temperature dropped and the clouds threatened more substantial snowfall, Owen found himself walking toward the main house. Katherine answered his knock, her smile brightening when she saw him. "Owen," she said, his first name still relatively new on her lips, "we weren't expecting you tonight." "I was hoping we could talk," he said, suddenly uncertain despite having rehearsed this moment in his mind a dozen times. "If you have time." Of course, she reached for her shawl. "Let's walk down to the corral. Father's going over the books in the study, and I wouldn't want to disturb him." They walked in companionable silence, the air crisp around them, stars beginning to emerge in the darkening sky. At the corral fence, they stopped, looking out over the ranch that had become the center of both their lives. "The first snow came today," Katherine said after a moment, her breath visible in the cold air. "Winter will be here soon." Owen nodded, hearing the unspoken question in her words. "I've been thinking about what you said, about having until the first snow to figure things out." Katherine turned to look at him, her expression carefully neutral despite the hope visible in her eyes. "And have you figured things out?" Owen took a deep breath, finding courage in the quiet strength of the woman beside him. "For a long time after the war, after losing my family, I believed the only way to survive out here was to keep moving, to avoid forming connections that could be broken, to protect myself from the pain of loss." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "I told myself that was wisdom, but now I see it was fear." "Fear is natural," Katherine said softly. "We've all felt it." "Yes, but living your entire life ruled by it isn't living at all," Owen replied. "I've learned that from you and your father, watching you fight for this place, for each other, even when it would have been easier and safer to give up." He reached out, taking her gloved hand in his. "I don't want to move on anymore, Katherine. I want to stay here on this ranch in this valley." His voice dropped lower, more intimate. "With you if you'll have me." Katherine's smile bloomed slowly, warming her entire face. "I was hoping you'd say that," she admitted. "I've been falling in love with you since the day you walked into the hotel and looked at me like you'd known me all your life." "I felt the same," Owen said, surprised by how easily the words came now that he'd made his decision. "Like I'd found something I didn't even know I was looking for." He drew her closer, one hand gently touching her cheek. "I love you, Katherine Hayden. I think I have since that first day, though I was too stubborn to admit it even to myself." "I love you too, Owen Quincy," she replied, her voice steady despite the emotion shining in her eyes. "Enough to wait for you to figure it out in your own time." Their first kiss was gentle, tentative, then deepening as they embraced the feelings they'd both held in check for so long. When they finally parted, snowflakes had begun to fall again, catching in Catherine's golden hair like tiny stars. "I should speak to your father," Owen said, suddenly aware of the propriety of the situation. Catherine laughed, the sound bright in the cold air. "He's been expecting it. I believe his exact words were, that young man had better make his intentions clear before winter, or I'll have to have a serious conversation with him." Owen smiled, feeling a lightness in his chest that had been absent for years. "Then I shouldn't keep him waiting." They walked hand in hand back to the house, the snow falling more steadily around them, transforming the ranch into a wonderland of white. For Owen, it felt like more than just a change of seasons. It was the beginning of a new life, one built on love and commitment rather than fear and isolation. James Hayden received Owen's request for his daughter's hand with gruff approval, and a firm handshake that conveyed both his blessing and his expectation that Owen would always cherish and protect Catherine as he himself had done. They were married 2 weeks later in the small church in Columbine Springs, with Sheriff Morris, recovered from his wound and recently re-elected, standing as Owen's best man. The entire town turned out for the celebration, embracing the union of Katherine Hayden, no longer hiding her identity, and the drifter who had helped save her family's ranch. As winter settled over the valley, bringing the deep snow and quiet days of the season, Owen and Catherine established their home in a cabin on the ranch property, close enough to the main house for family meals and assistance with ranch operations, but with enough privacy to begin their life together as husband and wife. On Christmas Eve, as they sat before the fire in their small but comfortable home, Catherine presented Owen with a gift, a framed photograph of the two of them on their wedding day, standing on the porch of the church, joy evident in their expressions. "For the mantle," she said, "the beginning of our own family history." Owen placed the photograph carefully on the wooden shelf above the fireplace, next to the Hayden family portrait that Catherine had kept hidden for so many months. The contrast between the images was striking, one representing the past she'd been forced to conceal, the other the future they would build together. "From now on," Owen said, drawing Catherine into his arms, "no more hiding who we are or what matters to us. No more photographs kept in drawers. No more running from connection," Catherine added, completing the thought as she so often did. "No more believing that love is a weakness rather than a strength." As they stood together before the fire, the snow falling silently outside their window, Owen reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. He had ridden into Columbine Springs believing the frontier was no place for putting down roots. That survival meant remaining unattached and ready to move on. Instead, he had found a home, a family, and a love that had transformed his understanding of what it meant to truly live in this vast, challenging land. The photograph on their mantle would be the first of many, a visual record of the life and legacy they would build together, not just surviving the frontier but thriving in it, their strength found in each other.